Welcome. This is Brooke Clons and Carly Dalton. Today we have Lani Forbes, author of The Seventh Son and Jade Bones. Our goal is to equip writers with the tools necessary to get published and be successful. And I think Lani is going to be the perfect person to talk to you about this. How are you inspired to write the Age of the Seventh Son series?
Well, I've always been a huge fan of young adult fantasy anyway. That's like my favorite genre to read. And so, of course, it's one of my favorite genres to write. And my family actually lives in Mexico. So my stepdad lived there for about 15 years. And then he and my mom got married. He raised us and just would always share stories about all of his time that he lived in Mexico, some of which was spent in prison, but that's a whole nother story. And so he and my mom actually moved back to Mexico several years ago. And so they've been living down there. They actually manage a drug treatment center down there. And so my family is just very involved with Mexico. And I've always just been really fascinated with ancient civilizations in particular. And so I love studying ancient Egypt. I love studying ancient Greece, ancient Mesoamerica. And so just being down in Mexico so much, I just was really getting inspired with some of these ideas, especially as I started hearing some of the mythology and actually getting to go to some of like the archaeological sites in Guatemala and Belize. And I was really inspired by the ancient Mesoamerican mythology. And so specifically, there's a myth called the myth of the five sons, which is a creation myth about how the world was created and destroyed multiple times. And so supposedly we're living in the age of the fifth son now. And I don't know, I loved that idea of like the world getting destroyed and recreated multiple times. And so that's really kind of where the seed of the idea started. And then it just kind of grew from there. So
that's really cool. So how did you create like the complex underworld?
Yeah, so the underworld's a really interesting part of book 2 specifically. And so I try to use the history mostly as my inspiration, especially because my mom's a research librarian. And so I've had beat into my brain from the time I was in high school the importance of like quality resources and making sure that you're looking at textbooks and you're looking at interviews with professors and not just reading on Wikipedia kind of stuff. And so I tried to do I actually read several textbooks and reached out to some different like research groups and tried to get as much information as I could about different historical groups in ancient Mesoamerica. And so the world of the seventh son, it's its own unique fantasy world. Like it's not actually based on any specific Mesoamerican culture, but I tried to definitely incorporate a lot of the historical elements of like how society was structured, how they interacted with different things. And so I tried to keep that really accurate. And the underworld in particular was inspired by the Popol Vuh, which is a Mayan historical document. And so it describes a lot of the mythology behind the Mayan underworld, Xibalba. And so I did a lot of research on that. And specifically, so a lot of the elements that you see in the underworld are inspired from the actual historical resource, specifically like the fact that there's 9 layers. And that's actually a really huge part of Mesoamerican mythology, is the idea that the underworld is 9 levels to kind of represent that there's 9 months to come into this world. So there's kind of 9 steps to leave this world as well. And I really loved that idea. So I wanted to stay really accurate to that. And then I actually got to go down to Guatemala and Belize and go into one of National Geographic's it's considered one of National Geographic's most sacred historical caves. And they believe it was the entrance to Xibalba. And so I actually got to like go in for several hours and actually like see artifacts and go through and talk to some of the local researchers. And it was a really cool experience. And so I got to incorporate a lot of what I learned through that as well.
So in those like the 9 layers, is it like trials as well? Like was that all accurate as far as like what Mayon had to go through and whatnot?
Yeah, so for the different trials, because what's interesting, if you actually look at like burial temples in like Tikal in Guatemala, for example, you notice that there's 9 levels. And that's kind of what that's supposed to represent. And so, yeah, the 9 levels are supposed to be like trials or tests to kind of prove your worth to make it into a paradise. And so in Maya mythology, the trials take place at different houses. Like once you make it to the city of the dead, there's supposed to be like 9 houses that have different trials you're supposed to go through. But then in the Aztec version, it's more of layers like as you go to each layer, there's a different trial at each layer. But that idea of trials to kind of prove your worth was definitely consistent across a variety of the different mythologies.
So what tips do you have like for somebody trying to build a world? Like where did you first start out, or like any kind of tips on world building, honestly?
Yeah, my favorite part about world building is do the research, especially because any world is going to be inspired by some kind of culture, some kind of actual people group, because, you know, as humans, we have certain tendencies of ways that we tend to do things. And so I think studying actual cultural inspirations can be really helpful to get ideas on how to organize a societal structure, how to organize transportation, how to organize, you know, dressing for the environment. I think the environment that your world takes place in affects a lot of those kinds of things. For example, you'll notice like in the world of the seventh son, there aren't wheels anywhere. There's no carts, there's no wheels. And that's actually historically accurate because just the terrain wasn't necessarily like they had toys and stuff that might have had wheels on them, but they didn't really use carts or wheels for transportation because it just really wasn't practical in the landscape that you were in. And so how does that affect things? Well, they traveled a lot by boats, or they traveled a lot by carrying things or carrying people. And so a lot of that kind of stuff you'll notice woven throughout the seventh son, because it's just a little cultural details of how the actual environment itself affects the world. Yeah, I think the biggest thing with world building is just being detailed for me. Like I want as much detail as possible. I try to think like a 4-year-old of like, well, why? Why is that like that? Why is that like that? And so just I kind of bring out that inner 4-year-old in my head of like, what would someone be asking if they were like, well, why is that like that? How did that come to be like that? How does that work? Da, 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 da. And in answering a lot of those questions for myself, it kind of helps me figure out some of those details that are my favorite part of world building. Is I love the details.
Uh-huh. That's
Interesting.
really fun. How did you come up with like your magic system?
Yeah.
What rules did you use to formulate those and build those out?
Yeah, so similar to the world building idea of just asking tons of questions about how it works. I've read a lot of different interviews with other authors, and there's different kinds of magic systems you can use in fantasy. There's what they call more like hard magic systems, which are very like there's very specific rules and there's very specific, you know, like details of how every little tiny thing works. And then there's more soft magic systems where maybe you don't really understand the rules as much, but it kind of leaves that mysterious, magical kind of feel to it. And so I think as an author, you kind of have to pick which type of magic system you want to lean towards, the more hard magic or the more soft magic. And I tend to lean more hard magic just because, like I said, I love the details. When I read fantasy, I just love learning all the tiny little details about things. So that's naturally the kind of magic system I think I gravitate towards. So for me, I always like to make sure that my magic has a source, which means where does the magic come from? Is the magic from the gods? Is the magic from these crystals they found in the earth? Is the magic something you're born with? Is it something that, you know, you have to learn? Is it something that comes naturally? You know, where does the magic come from? And then you have to have rules about how that magic works. So how is it accessed? Who can access it? You know, those kinds of things are really important. And then lastly, I think magic is most interesting when there's some kind of setback to it. So you have to have source, structure, and setbacks is kind of how I think of it. Specifically setbacks in that magic is interesting when it doesn't solve all your problems. In fact, it tends to be more interesting when it actually creates more problems than it solves. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that my magic system had some kind of setback to it, that it doesn't work in these certain situations. And so like in the seventh son, the magic system is tied to blood, which I found really important to do, like I said, just culturally for the for ancient Mesoamerica, because blood was such an important thing for them culturally, that they believed it held the power of creation. And just this idea of power being in blood, I just kind of loved that idea. And so I kind of went with that. And so my source is that their magic comes from being descended from the different gods and goddesses. So that's where the source is. And then the structure is that it only works when it's exposed. So you have to like expose the blood in order to access the magic. But then the setback is as soon as it heals, your magic's gone and you can't use it anymore. So it's like you can only use it for as long as it's exposed. And then once it heals, you can't. And then your magic is limited to how much blood can you shed? Because if you are bleeding a lot, obviously you're going to pass out at some point. So there's that setback of like, how do I can't just magically use tons of magic all the time. I have to keep in mind, and you notice that a lot in the Jade Bones, where Akin's kind of mad at Mayana because she's willing to just keep kind of self-sacrificing to like use her magic to try to get them out of these situations. And he's like, you know, you can't do that. You're going to run out of blood here in a minute. You know, like we can't keep doing that. And so it adds more tension. I think it adds a lot more interesting plot dynamics and conflict when you have those setbacks to the magic, that it doesn't just fix every problem. So
I think you did a great job with that. Like, fantastic job with that, with the magic.
thank you.
I love that idea. When she has to like slit her wrist to do the water magic. I love that.
Yeah, and then the other limitation is that they can only do the magic of whatever their ancestor is. So like Mayana can only manipulate water, Akin can only manipulate light, Yemenia can only heal, but one of her limitations is that she can't actually heal herself. She can only heal others. And so like there's those little limitations that add fun points of conflict that you can use for different plot points, or you can use for different ways to create more tension and excitement in the story too.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned in another interview on the Nerd Daily about how you struggled with postpartum depression and how writing helped you cope with that. Can you tell anyone who's going through something like that how it can help them cope through that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like I said, I'm finishing my master's right now in clinical psychology with an emphasis in trauma. And I think I'm a huge mental health advocate, and just I am very open about the fact that like I have mental health struggles. I struggled with severe anxiety and depression for a long time, even before I had children. And then just when I had children, it was really difficult for me to cope with the postpartum depression. And it was one of the things that really inspired me to take writing a lot more seriously, specifically. After my daughter was born, she was diagnosed with an atypical form of cystic fibrosis. And so I had been struggling anyway. And then as soon as we got that diagnosis when she was 2 weeks old, I just kind of went over a ledge, and my doctor was like, we need to get you on medication. It was a really difficult time. Mm-hmm. And I think I learned through that, I think culturally, we expect a lot of mothers, especially new mothers, where we expect them to kind of self-sacrifice everything, where it's like, you no longer exist as a person. Your purpose is all about your children and the child. And so I think that mindset is really kind of harmful to a lot of new moms specifically. And so I realized that going in, that I was not taking care of myself at all when I had my daughter. I wasn't really doing anything for self-care. I was just staying up all hours. I was not sleeping. I wasn't doing these things. And then it started to manifest in just these really harmful ways. And so for me, with when I had my son, my second child, I recognized the importance of making sure that I still had something for me that kind of fed who I am as a person and fed my soul a little bit. And so for me, that was writing. And it gave me something to do that was mine, that was like this little piece of my soul that I could feed and still remember, like, okay, this is a part of who I am outside of this identity of being a mother. And it also gave me something to do, like at those nights at 3 o'clock in the morning where my son's asleep on my chest and I'm afraid to move him because I don't want to wake him up, but like, I don't want to sit there for the next 3 hours either. So I would pull out my phone and I would write. And so I actually wrote most of book 1, The Seventh Son, on my phone.
That's nuts. I don't think I could do that. I heard, did you just talk into your phone and have it transcribe it for you, or were you typing on your phone?
I mostly typed. I have Google Docs on my phone. And so to this day, I still do a lot of my writing on my phone just because I'm busy and I'm always doing things. And it just, if I'm at, the park with the kids and I've got, they're playing on the playground and I've got an extra 20 minutes, I'll pull up my phone and I'll just start typing. And so for me, it was really helpful that, I actually wrote most of The Seventh Son in about a 1.5 month, 2 month period while my son was about 2 months old.
Wow.
That is dedication. So you can't.
I can't handle my phone's keyboard.
Oh, yeah. And not everyone who struggles with depression, or specifically postpartum depression, is able to write, because there's some times where like it was too much, where I just felt like I couldn't write and couldn't do it for myself. But for me, figuring out what is that thing that you're able to still do for self-care, that is the most important thing. And so for me, that was writing at the time, and it was a big help for me, and medication was very helpful as well. And so yeah, for me, that was the most helpful. And then community is a big part too, because I think a lot of new moms, or anyone that really is in a place of depression, we tend to isolate and we tend to like not reach out to people. And so for me, getting involved in a local writing group, getting involved with the writing community was actually a really big helpful way for me too, to kind of make sure that I wasn't isolating. And so writing provided that self-care piece. It provided community for me. It just provided a lot of things that helped, I think, hedge against some of the downsides of postpartum depression.
It's really so important. That's one of the big things that I've loved about Instagram. Like my writing group that I normally went to, as soon as COVID hit, like nobody wanted to do it online. And so they just stopped. But at least on Instagram, like I can still reach out. I can still talk to other writers. I can still talk to the other writers too, but it's all virtual now.
Mhm.
But we can do things like this where we talk virtually. Did you ever funnel like any of like your emotions or your frustrations like into your writing?
Yeah, I can't not do that as a writer. I think, and that's true for at least a lot of other writers I talk to, is that just we tend to funnel a lot of ourselves and like pieces of our own souls into whatever we write, I think. And I think that's what gives so many stories the heart and spark that they need to really touch other people, because stories are about transformation, and they're about learning and growing, and they're about, like, as a writer, I'm trying to share a journey that I hope will touch my reader, that they can learn and grow and inspire from as well. And so, yeah, a lot of the Seventh Son series in general kind of has to do with my own frustrations of feeling trapped or constricted within a particular system or within a particular institution, and feeling suffocated and wanting to ask questions and wanting to push back, but not feeling like I'm allowed to, or feeling shamed for having questions, or wanting to understand things a little bit better. And so for me, I think a lot of that got funneled into Mayana's character specifically. And then in the Jade Bones, a lot of Yemenia's journey, because she's the new POV character in the Jade Bones, a lot of her journey is kind of discovering her self-worth. And I think that's something that a lot of women can relate to. And so I definitely channeled some of that into Yemenia as well, of not allowing other people to define your worth, but defining your worth for yourself.
Her character arc was done so well, like from the beginning to the end of Jade Bones. I'm like, okay, like I felt her change. I felt her grow. Like you nailed it on her character arc.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Like, I think the character arc is one of the single most important things in a book. Like, you can't not have them. Did you ever feel like giving up when you were writing? How'd you keep going?
I think the very first writing conference I ever went to, I think I hadn't even really started working on, I was actually working on a different project when I went to my first writing conference. I hadn't started the Seventh Son yet. And I wanted to go to this writing conference. I found one that was like pretty local, and I was like, oh, that'd be kind of fun to go to, but I don't know, I'm not really a writer. I can't really do this thing. And my son's like only, a couple months old, he's only like a month old. I can't go to this. And my husband literally like took the baby out of my arms and was like, you need to do this for yourself, go. And so like, I literally like packed up my little breast pump and like had to sit in the bathroom at the writers conference.
I've done that.
Could still pump. And it was the first time I'd ever really been exposed to the writing community. And I just remember feeling like kind of overwhelmed of like, oh my gosh, there's so much I don't know. And there's so much that I had no clue about. And I didn't even know where to start. I didn't know where to begin. And I sat down with, I think it was an editor for something that it was just like kind of like a little small editor kind of thing. And I remember kind of talking about my book idea, and he just kind of looked at me and was like, yeah, that'll never sell. And I was like, what? And so I kind of went home from that conference, like inspired by like seeing all these people that I felt like, I'm like, whoa, there's other people like me that like make up stuff in their head all the time and are constantly reading books. And so on the one hand, I felt inspired that I felt like I'd found all these other kind of people that I could relate to. But then like that speaking to that editor really kind of shook me a little bit. And I was like, I don't think I can do this. There's like way too much that goes into this. Like, I don't think I can do it. But then I couldn't stop. So like, as soon as I was like, okay, well, I can't do that idea. And then like other ideas started, I'm like, well, what about this idea? What about that idea? And I was like, no, I can't do that. And I just couldn't stop doing it. And so it's like one of my favorite quotes is, if you can quit, quit. And if you can't, you're a writer.
Agreed. That's how I feel. Like it doesn't matter if you never make a dime. You just keep going, because you can't stop. You can't give up.
And it's because it's hard because there is a lot of rejection and there's a lot of, you get negative reviews or you get people that misinterpret things or that like make assumptions about you that aren't true, or there's a lot of like negative stuff that can come along with this. And in those moments you always are like, that's it, I don't want to do this anymore, I quit, I give up, this is too hard. Or you get that agent that's like, yeah, this is horrible, why are you even writing? And you're like, I don't know, why am I writing? And so you're like, I'm gonna quit. And I have those days sometimes where like for like a day I'm like, that's it, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm done. And then like 20 minutes later I'm like, oh, what about this idea?
You can make it better. I can fix it.
Yeah, I can't stop. So even though I have those days, and I think it's okay for every writer to have those days, you're just like, this is it, I quit, I can't do it. And then literally give it some time, and pretty much if you are a true writer, I think it always comes back.
It does. It's like this like haunting thing, like you can't be happy without doing it.
It won't leave you alone, and you're like, fine, I'll do it, okay.
Stop keeping me up at night.
Fine, I'll write it down.
What gets you excited and inspired? Like you say you can't stop, but is there any time where you're like, oh, I'm just stuck? Like what gets you back into it and inspired again?
Yeah, when I get stuck, I love reading other books or watching movies, or what, like for me, like just getting into a good story, because I just love story so much. I love storytelling. I love getting into a good character. I love, and so if I'm struggling with my own story, I'll kind of put it down for a minute and I'll try to like get into a different book or get into a show. Like I got really into the Witcher series on Netflix, and like that show just inspired me so much, just about like the world and the characters, and just it got me so excited about things. So for me, when I get stuck, I just try to find something that can kind of re-spark that love for story. Or even just reading craft books for some reason. Like I noticed you had shared on your Instagram about the Save the Cat books. And I know some people are like, Save the Cat, it's so basic. And I'm like, it's really good. I love this stuff. You take that and you build on it, of course, but like to me, so I've actually been listening to Save the Cat Strikes Back on audio. And so like when I've been getting stuck, I'll go and like listen to a chapter of that, and just it kind of gets that creative.
Yeah, it just gets, honestly, like I actually don't use Save the Cat to outline my books. I go back in after I've outlined it and see like, is there anywhere here that I could improve my plot with the structure that they've suggested? You know what I mean? Before I start writing.
And that's actually what I do too, is I tend to go back and make sure I hit the Save the Cat beats after the fact. Or if I get stuck, I'll be like, okay, what should be happening kind of about this part of the story? And so for me, I don't know if it's just the way that like hearing, I don't know, the camaraderie between like whoever wrote the craft book, and it's like talking to you as a writer and taking you seriously as a writer. And I don't know what it is, but just for some reason that kind of gets me inspired too. So I love reading craft books if I get really stuck.
Yeah, for sure. I love craft books. I honestly don't know how people could be writers without them.
I agree. Yeah.
They're inspiring. And it doesn't mean, I've heard a lot of people say like, well, I don't like to do that because it stifles my creativity. And I'm like, well, it's like being an artist. Like you can go to school to be an artist and you learn the rules, you learn the basics, you learn the things so that you kind of have those in your head, but then you can make the conscious choice to break it. It's like I went to a really great conference where I heard someone talk about it's the difference between a cook and a chef. A cook just follows the recipe no matter what and doesn't divert from it. But like a chef knows the recipe and can kind of follow the recipe, but then they can add their own flair and creativity to it as well. Yeah. But you still kind of have to have a knowledge of the good recipes and that basic cooking knowledge before you can start getting creative and doing fancy stuff. So
yeah, that's another thing I like to do when I finished a book is like go read some craft books, and then sometimes they'll spark ideas to make my book better. And then I'll go back to my book and add it,
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Lani. That was amazing information, and that is all we have time for today. So be sure to check out her book. The Seventh Son is book 1. The Jade Bones is book 2. I love them both so much. And they're available on Amazon and at most bookstores, correct?
Yes.
That's what I thought. And then be sure to join us next week for when we have Lani talk about marketing strategies and how to land an agent. Thanks again.
Thank you.